In the American story, King George III is a caricature. He is the villain of the Revolution, the tyrant on a distant throne, the final grievance in a long list of grievances. The Declaration of Independence paints him as a monster, a man whose character is marked by every act which may define a tyrant, and who is therefore unfit to be the ruler of a free people. For millions, this is the only King George they know, a two-dimensional figure of obstinance and royal arrogance. The antagonist our heroes had to defeat. But what if that was only one side of the story? What if the tyrant was also a victim? Let us shift our focus from Philadelphia in 1776 to Windsor Castle in 1788. Years after the American War was lost, a crisis is unfolding. But this is not a crisis of politics or war. It is a crisis of the mind. The King of England, the most powerful man on earth, is coming undone. His behavior is terrifying and baffling to all who witness it. He speaks non-stop, sometimes for 24 hours straight, his voice growing hoarse, foam frothing at his mouth. His rambling monologues leap from topic to topic, from Shakespeare to trivial court gossip. He claims to have met King Frederick the Great of Prussia, who had died 2 years earlier, in the afterlife. He weeps uncontrollably, then erupts into fits of rage, even physically assaulting his own son, the Prince of Wales. He has to be restrained, strapped to a chair for his own safety. This was not the act of a tyrant calculating a political move. This was the terrifying spectacle of a mind shattering into pieces. And it poses a chilling question. Was the man who lost America simply a stubborn villain? Or was he the victim of a catastrophic illness, a storm that had been brewing in his mind for years? To understand the history, we must first investigate the tragedy. To understand the man who collapsed, we must first meet the man who ascended. When George III took the throne in 1760 at the age of just 22, he was a breath of fresh air. Unlike his German-born grandfather and great-grandfather, George was born in England, spoke English as his first language, and was deeply patriotic. In his accession speech to Parliament, he famously declared, "Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain." He was, by all accounts, a man of simple tastes and profound moral seriousness. He was pious, hard-working, and utterly devoted to his wife, Queen Charlotte, with whom he would have 15 children. He shunned the decadent lifestyles of his predecessors, preferring quiet family life and his hobbies of farming, architecture, and astronomy. He was, at first, a popular and well-intentioned ruler, determined to reign as a constitutional monarch who was both virtuous and strong. But the throne he inherited was not a stable one. It was the throne of a burgeoning global empire, an empire rife with political factions and soon to be facing its greatest crisis. That crisis, of course, was America. The 7 Years' War had left Britain victorious over France, but also with a mountain of debt. To pay for it, Parliament looked to the American colonies. The Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act to the British government. These were reasonable measures to make the colonies pay for their own defense. To the Americans, they were an intolerable assault on their rights as Englishmen, an act of tyranny from a distant king. For King George, This was not an abstract political debate. It was a deeply personal crisis. He saw the colonies not as a separate people, but as his own subjects, his own children. He viewed the growing unrest in Boston and Philadelphia with the bewilderment and anger of a father whose authority was being defied. He could not comprehend the colonists' desire for independence. To him, it was an act of base ingratitude and rebellion against a benevolent parent country. His letters from the period show a man digging in his heels, convinced that any concession would lead to the unraveling of his entire empire. He wrote, "We must either master them or totally leave them to themselves and treat them as aliens." He supported the harsh measures. He approved the dispatch of troops, and he saw the war as a necessary, if painful, police action to bring his wayward children back into line. The war would rage for 8 long years. The ultimate defeat at Yorktown in 1781 was more than a military and political catastrophe for Britain. For King George III, it was a devastating, humiliating, and personal failure. He had lost the brightest jewel in his crown. The stress and grief of this loss were immense, a psychological blow that, combined with the intense pressures of rule, would fester in his mind, providing fertile ground for the terrible illness that was waiting in the wings. The major crisis of 1788 was not the first time the king's health had failed, but it was by far the most severe. It was the moment the private suffering of the man became a public catastrophe for the monarch. To his physicians, the king's condition was a baffling and terrifying puzzle. They were confronted with a collection of symptoms so bizarre, they seemed to defy any known ailment. The first was the mania. The king would enter periods of intense, frenetic energy, talking incessantly for hours on end, his voice growing raw, his speeches becoming a torrent of disconnected thoughts. Courtiers recorded him speaking for 24, even 48 hours, with no sleep, until foam flecked his lips, and his physicians could only stand by in helpless astonishment. His mind raced, producing thousands of pages of frantic, rambling letters. This mania was often accompanied by violent rages and delusions. He would verbally abuse his family and servants, and on several occasions became so physically aggressive that he had to be forcibly restrained by his pages, strapped into a special chair to prevent him from harming himself or others. He would claim to be conducting orchestras and would hold conversations with people who were not there. Then, just as suddenly, the mania would vanish, replaced by a profound and weeping depression. He would be overwhelmed with guilt and despair, apologizing for his behavior, aware that he had lost control of his own mind. A realization that was perhaps the cruelest torture of all. But the most bizarre clue, the one that mystified his 18th century doctors, was a physical one. During his episodes, the king's urine would reportedly turn a deep blue or reddish-purple color. To his physicians, it was a frightening but inexplicable symptom. To modern medical historians, it is this smoking gun. For centuries, George III was simply known as the Mad King. His illness was diagnosed as a form of insanity, a psychiatric condition. But in the 20th century, a new, compelling theory emerged. A theory that suggests the king was not mad at all, but was the victim of a debilitating physical disease. This theory is Porphyria. Porphyria is a rare, hereditary blood disorder that affects the body's production of heme, a substance essential for red blood cells. When this process goes wrong, toxic chemicals called porphyrins build up in the body and can wreak havoc on the nervous system. Now consider the known neurological symptoms of an acute porphyria attack: severe anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, delirium, rapid heart rate, and crucially, severe abdominal, chest, and limb pain. The king complained of all of these, but the final, definitive link is the most famous symptom of certain types of porphyria, the patient's urine, turning a dark reddish purple, the exact color described in the notes of King George's own physicians. The madness of King George was likely not a disease of the mind, but a disease of the blood that was attacking his mind. He was not a lunatic. He was a man in the grips of a catastrophic neurological storm. This diagnosis recasts him entirely. He was not a tyrant descending into madness, but a man of immense duty, desperately trying to rule an empire while his own body and mind were being poisoned from within. While the king battled the demons in his mind, a new battle, one of political ambition and constitutional crisis, erupted in the halls of Parliament. With the king completely incapacitated, the government of Great Britain was effectively paralyzed. The country had a throne, but no one was on it. This power vacuum ignited a desperate struggle for control. On one side was the king's own son and heir, George, the Prince of Wales. The prince was everything his father was not: extravagant, flamboyant, a notorious womanizer who was buried under a mountain of personal debt. He had long been a political opponent of his father, aligning himself with the opposition party led by the charismatic Charles James Fox. For the prince and his allies, the king's madness was not a tragedy. It was a golden opportunity. They immediately began scheming to have the king declared permanently and incurably insane, which would allow the prince to seize power not as a temporary caretaker, but as a full-fledged prince regent, with all the powers of a king. This would allow him to dismiss his father's government, install his own friends in power, and get the treasury to pay off his colossal debts. On the other side stood the Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger. Pitt was fiercely loyal to the king and knew that if the prince took power, he and his government would be thrown out immediately. For Pitt, this was a battle for political survival. He played a desperate game, stalling for time. He insisted on lengthy examinations of the king's doctors, hoping to find any sign of potential recovery. He argued in Parliament that it was the right of Parliament, not the automatic right of the prince, to decide the terms of a regency. The political maneuvering was intense. Pitt introduced a regency bill with heavy restrictions, giving the prince the title of regent, but keeping key powers, like the ability to create new peers or sell the king's property, out of his hands. The prince and his allies were furious, accusing Pitt of trying to rule from behind the throne of a madman. London was a hotbed of rumor and conspiracy. The fate of the empire hung in the balance, dependent not on votes or armies, but on the fluctuating state of a sick man's mind. The Regency Bill was on the verge of passing in February 1789, and the prince's victory seemed imminent. And then the unthinkable happened. The king started to get better. His recovery was as sudden and dramatic as his descent. The non-stop talking ceased. The delusions faded, and his reason returned. Pitt triumphantly announced the news to Parliament, scuttling the Regency Bill just as it was about to become law. The prince's power grab had failed when the king made his first public appearance. The country erupted in spontaneous celebration. Churches rang their bells, and massive crowds cheered for the monarch who had returned from the abyss. The crisis was over. For now, the king's recovery in 1789 was a miracle, but the damage had been done, and the disease that haunted him was not gone, only dormant. For the next decade, he ruled effectively, but under a constant shadow, terrified of the malady's return. There were minor relapses, but he managed to function. But in 1810, the final, unbearable tragedy struck. His youngest and most beloved daughter, the 27-year-old Princess Amelia, died a slow and painful death. The king, who adored her, was consumed by a grief so profound that it shattered the fragile peace in his mind. The malady returned with a vengeance, and this time it would not let him go. The king descended into his final, permanent madness. The last decade of his life is one of history's great tragedies. A regency was finally declared, and his spendthrift son at last took power. King George III, meanwhile, became a ghost in his own palace. He was confined to a set of private apartments at Windsor Castle, a prisoner of his own mind. His physical health deteriorated along with his mental state. The cataracts that had plagued him for years finally claimed his sight completely. He became profoundly deaf. He was now trapped in a world of total darkness and silence, populated only by the phantoms of his own fractured memory. Attendants would describe the poignant and horrifying spectacle of the old king, his hair and beard grown long and white, wandering the halls of the castle in his dressing gown. He would spend hours at his harpsichord, playing loudly and singing until his voice was hoarse. He would hold long, detailed conversations with ministers who had been dead for decades. He would speak to imaginary angels, and most heartbreakingly, he would hold conversations with his beloved daughter Amelia, as if she were still there with him in the room. He lived on like this for 10 years, completely unaware that he was still the King of England, unaware of the Napoleonic Wars that raged and ended, unaware of the empire that was being run in his name. He died in 1820, a blind, deaf, and lonely old man. A stranger to the world, he still technically ruled. History has two versions of King George III. For America, he will forever be the tyrant, the villain of the nation's founding story. But the truer story, the more human one, is far more tragic. It is the story of a man who tried to be a good king while battling a terrifying, misunderstood disease that repeatedly tore his world apart. His reign was not just the story of an empire lost. It was the story of a mind lost, a profound human catastrophe that played out on a royal stage. History remembers the tyrant, but often forgets the man. If you believe the most compelling chronicles are the ones that reveal the tragic human stories behind the great events of the past, subscribe to the Black Chronicle and activate notifications. Tell us in the comments, which other historical villain do you believe deserves a second look?